Hello, welcome back. I'd like to introduce you all to the chair of our final session. This session is People and the Transition to Climate Neutrality, and our chair for this session is Dr. Diarmuid Thorney, Associate Professor in the School of Law and Government in Dublin City University. Welcome, Diarmuid.
Thank you very much, Mary Frances, and thank you to the EPA for the invitation to chair this concluding panel of what has been a stimulating and engaging conference. Good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to this session. Today's sessions collectively aim to put people at the centre of climate action. This is a very welcome step and emphasises the point that we can't successfully tackle climate change with science and technology alone. Perspectives from other disciplines and standpoints, including the humanities and social sciences, provide important tools to unlock climate action. It is important that in our quest to place people at the centre of climate action and to understand the human and societal drivers of climate change, that we do not confuse this with a perspective that places undue emphasis on the role of individual actions alone. And those of you who tuned in to the previous panel will have heard this point emphasised strongly. Individual choices are shaped and constrained by the systems in which we live and work, and I expect that our keynote speaker today will elaborate on this particular theme. Furthermore, it is important in my view that in placing people at the centre, we do so with fairness and justice to the forefront. This theme came up during the previous panel and also during yesterday's proceedings. And if I may, I'd like to quote one of yesterday's speakers, Dr. Hannah Daly from UCC, who remarked very wisely, I think, that this transition won't be fair and it won't be feasible if the rich get all the carrot and the poor get all the stick, which I thought was a really good way of capturing the importance of fairness and justice. And that's a theme that came up in the previous panel and I think will, I'm sure, come up in our discussion in this panel. The format for this panel will follow the format for previous panels in the conference. We will first hear a keynote address followed by 3 interventions from expert contributors. That in turn will be followed by time for Q&A, and I would encourage you to submit questions for our speakers via the platform in the way that you've been doing throughout the conference. The keynote address in this panel will be delivered by Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh of Bath University and is entitled People First, the Role of Society in the Transition to Climate Neutrality. Lorraine is an environmental psychologist specialising in perceptions and behaviour in relation to climate change, energy and transport. She is director of the ESRC-funded UK Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. She regularly advises government and other organisations on low-carbon behaviour change and climate change communication, and she was one of the expert leads for the Climate Assembly UK. She's also a lead author for Working Group 2 of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. Furthermore, she is one of 12 members of the newly formed Climate Crisis Advisory Group, chaired by Sir David King. I understand that the group held its first public meeting earlier today, which was to be live streamed on YouTube. We may have an opportunity to come back to that in the panel discussion later, but for now, I would like to hand the floor to Lorraine for her keynote address.
Thank you very much, Diarmuid. It's really great to be here. And I really enjoyed the session just now. And I think I'm going to be building on a lot of the topics that came up from those speakers. And really, the point I want to emphasize is just how critical people are in the transformations needed to tackle climate change. And I think maybe sometimes there's an assumption or maybe a traditional assumption amongst policymakers that the role of people is essentially as consumers, that people will be required to buy greener products, to buy the green technologies that will get us to where we want to be to tackle climate change. And while the consumer role is definitely an important one that people play, there are many more things, of course, that people are than just consumers. They are citizens, so they can vote for policies that tackle climate change. They're members of families, they're parents, they are members of communities. they're also employees and employers. And so there's a whole range of different contexts in which people can exert influence, as well as directly reducing their own emissions. They can shape the actions of others through various means. And I think that's really critical when we're thinking about the ways in which we can engage people in a transformation to tackle climate change, is thinking about these various different roles. And so, for example, the Committee on Climate Change estimates that about 60% of what we need to get to net zero involves behaviour change. Actually, that's primarily just thinking about people as consumers. It's probably closer to about 100% if we think about this much broader role. And as Dermot has really just emphasised, fairness is really critical. Actually, it's one of the strongest predictors of policy acceptance amongst the public. We found that it's even more important than the perceived effectiveness of policies. And actually, so we really need to listen to people in terms of what do they see as being fair policies? How will they be impacted by policies in different ways? How will different groups be affected? And by listening to those voices and involving the public in decision-making about how we can reach our climate change targets and transform society, it's not just that those decisions will be fairer, they will be, but also they're likely to be better. Actually, participatory policy making tends to improve the quality of outcomes as well. So this is not just a moral argument, this is actually a pragmatic one. Let's engage the public if we're actually to deliver the wide range of changes needed to tackle climate change. And as Tony said before the break, we need that political will to make these very broad changes. And so actually showing that the public is on board is really critical as part of that, building that social mandate for change. But actually, we also need people to be involved in delivering this transformation. And so, as I've said, there's a huge range of ways in which people will be helping to deliver that. And this involves changing people's behaviours. And so we can do that in a number of different ways. We sort of broadly categorise behaviour change strategies as downstream and upstream. So downstream are where you're sort of shaping people's choices directly through usually information provision of one kind or another, whereas upstream interventions are where you're trying to change the context in which people are acting through economic measures or regulations or other sorts of things which essentially make different choices easier, cheaper, more available, and so on. So they kind of facilitate behaviour change. They remove the barriers to behaviour change. And we need both of these categories of interventions. We need the downstream and we need the upstream. We need the downstream because there are still some information gaps in public understanding of climate change. So when we ask people what's the most effective thing you can do to tackle climate change, we often find that people will refer to things like turning off the tap when brushing your teeth, or maybe switching off lights that you're not using, things that are actually pretty easy to do. And they've tended to be what have been the focus of information campaigns in the past, the sort of simple and painless things that we can do to change our behaviour. But those are not really the most effective things. The most effective things are probably things like changing our diet to eat less red meat and dairy, buying less stuff, flying and driving less. And actually, there's less awareness amongst the public about a lot of these things, particularly about the embedded emissions, for example, in our diet. So there are information gaps. So there is a role still for information to improve decision making and people's awareness about what they can do effectively. But information is limited, and I think Professor Lunn made that point very eloquently. Actually, information can only get us so far, and part of the reason for that is because actually people perceive information in different ways, the same messages in different ways. So we found in a study a few years ago, actually, we gave a group of members of the public 2 pieces of information about climate change. They were basically kind of newspaper editorials, one in which it advocated bold action to tackle climate change, and one which was a much more skeptical argument, saying that the risks are hyped and we don't need to do anything. And we measured people's attitudes to climate change before and after reading these 2 messages. And what we found was that people that prior to reading the information we'd identified as being more skeptical about climate change, that group actually became much less convinced about climate change, having read these 2 articles. Whereas the people who had were already concerned and accepting that climate change was a real issue, those people became slightly more concerned and convinced about climate change. And these people read the same messages. So this study, but also a lot of other evidence, shows that actually we tend to kind of just gravitate towards information which reinforces what we already believe. And we can often reject or ignore information which contradicts our views. And that's because we have kind of lots of biases and filters through which information comes to us. We don't all see information in the same way. And that means it's actually very difficult to change people's behaviours or people's attitudes once they've made up their mind about something. But there are things we can do. And as we heard before the break, it's about knowing your audience, knowing what they care about, and targeting your message to resonate with those values. We found in some work a few years ago that actually messages about mitigating climate change, so reducing emissions, those tended to resonate much better with people that were already concerned about climate change. So they were on board with the need to do something, and they agreed with the message that we need to mitigate it. For people that were much less concerned, didn't think it was a particularly big deal, actually those people tended to be more open to messages about adapting to the impacts of climate change. For that group, maybe it was news that this was an issue that was relevant to them, and actually that they can do things to protect themselves from those impacts. So we found some difference there according to whether people were concerned or not concerned about climate change. We've also found that you don't even need to necessarily talk about climate change at all, and you can engage audiences in terms of reducing their energy use by talking about that in different ways, completely different ways. So we compared messages where we either emphasized that this was that saving energy was about reducing waste and you could save money, and this was kind of common sense. Why would you throw money away? That was the waste message. We had a message which was about kind of more about energy security, and this is good for British jobs. This was a British sample. And then we had one that was more about kind of what's the right thing to do, and equity and justice and climate justice. So the poorest are the ones that are suffering the most, the richest are the more to blame. And what we found was that people on the left of centre politically preferred the justice message. The people on the right of centre preferred like that one the least. Whereas the waste one was actually had more universal appeal, interestingly. And these differences, while they weren't enormous, they were significant. And so we found just by changing the way in which we talk to audiences, we found different effects. And there are interesting real world examples. The Oxfam campaign from a few years ago, For the Love Of, was a great example of where you could enter some information about something that you cared about. It could be anything from chocolate to cricket to your garden. And you would get information back about how that specific thing is likely to be affected by climate change. And so you could start to see, oh, this is an issue which is relevant to me and actually might be a problem in terms that I care about. And we have to be better, I think, at communicating in ways that do resonate with what people care about. And marketers have been great at doing this for a long time. They've segmented their audiences. And so they talk about green benefits of their products to green consumers, and they talk about more personal benefits to other people. And it works brilliantly because it appeals to those different audience values. But more generally, we know that mitigating climate change has a whole range of different additional co-benefits, ranging from kind of health to equity, well-being, security, green jobs, saving money, and so on. And the more that we can frame messages around mitigation in the direction of these other benefits, the more we're likely to resonate with broader audiences. To give you one example that I don't think is exploited enough, but I think we should do more of, is talking about well-being. Actually, we know that consumption, buying stuff, doesn't satisfy our psychological needs. Actually, materialism tends to negatively affect people's well-being, and people with sort of greener, low consumption lifestyles tend to have higher well-being. This is a message that then we can use to actually bring people on board with the transformation needed to tackle climate change. Doing green things will make you happier. And so I think these are the sorts of messages that we need to focus more on. And of course, as we heard as well before the break, actually, there are things we can learn from COVID here, because we also need to build a sense of collective action, because it's not enough that individuals change their own behaviour. And people know this, they know it's a collective action. The more, though, that we can convey climate action as being something that people are already starting to do, and that we are part of a larger group, and that leaders are taking action, and that other people like them are taking action, the more it will seem that our action is effective, but also that it's fair that we're part of this collective movement. So again, in studies, we've shown that this is an effective way to engage people. And just finally, on information, we can also use social norms. And this is a really well tried and tested approach. So in some classic studies, they gave people information in that when they came to residents in a hotel or visitors to a hotel to encourage them to reuse their towels. And when they talked about how many people were already reusing their towels rather than getting a fresh one every day, the more they were able to show that that was a social norm, the more they got people to reuse their towels. So people do like to conform to what other people are doing. So we can use information to emphasize the changes that people are already starting to make. And so making low carbon action more normal is an effective approach. But as we've said, and as we've already heard, information alone is rarely enough to change behaviour. It's actually relatively ineffective in the grand scheme of things. We do need it, but we need a lot more besides. So we need to change the context of action as well. So if we want to change behaviour, we need to redesign our cities, we need to implement economic incentives, etc. So all of these things are also needed to remove the broader barriers to behaviour change. And I'll just finish by just mentioning one thing that I'm increasingly interested in, and I think is really underappreciated, is when to intervene as well, because we know that habits are a really big barrier to lifestyle change. We just we're on autopilot quite a lot of the time. We do the same thing that we always have done. We consume the same way, we eat the same way. And habits are a big barrier to getting people to do low carbon things if they're not used to it. But habits do become weaker during certain moments of change, as we call them. And so, for example, moving house is a good example. Once you move house, lots of things have to be figured out for the first time. How am I going to get to the shops? How am I going to get to work? And so if you can intervene at that point, when somebody has just moved house, you can maybe, as in this study, they gave people some information about their local bus service. They gave them a one-day free pass to try the bus. And they found that quite low cost, fairly simple intervention was very effective amongst people that had recently moved house. So it more than doubled the uptake of bus use. Whereas those people that had not recently moved house, it didn't significantly change their information. So this is the same intervention. It worked with people whose habits had recently been disrupted, so they were more open to changing their behaviour. It didn't work for the people with the more stable habits. And we can learn a lot here, I think, right now, because COVID has disrupted our lifestyles in a way that, we haven't had for decades. And, it has actually created various low carbon habits. So people have been traveling less, they've been consuming less, they've been spending their spare time doing actually relatively low carbon things a lot of the time, like gardening, more creative hobbies. And when we've surveyed people, as we have over the last year, about what are these changes that they've been made to make, they actually plan to continue doing, a lot of people want to do at least some of these things in the longer term. They want to travel less. They want to keep some of these hobbies that they've been adopting as well. But the key thing is, in order to lock in these good intentions and these emerging habits, we need this broader infrastructure change, incentives, all of this context change, upstream interventions that I've just mentioned. So I'll just finish by kind of reiterating people are essential for the transition needed to tackle climate change. And there is already strong public support, as we've seen in the last session. There is public support for a lot of the actions needed to tackle climate change. But we still need to engage with people to understand what's important to them so that we can communicate more effectively with them. We need to involve them in the decision making about how to get to net zero. We need to design interventions which have broader co-benefits, so for well-being, for example. And we need multiple interventions, not just the downstream information campaigns. We need a lot of upstream stuff as well to make it easier and cheaper for people to do the right thing. And we need to get the timing right. We need to target our interventions to when people's habits are weaker. And I think as we start to think about a post-COVID world, as we start to transition out of restrictions, this is the time when we can really lock in some of these emerging low-carbon behaviours that we've been experimenting with over the last year and a bit. And yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. That was a fantastic keynote address, and also a really nice, I think, transition from the last panel to this panel. A lot of what you said obviously resonated quite clearly with the discussion we had or we heard in the last panel, and lots of interesting food for thought there around the context for actions for behaviour change. The idea of climate change as a collective action problem, the need to talk about well-being and co-benefits, and an important piece there around COVID and habits and timing. So I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to come back to some of those themes in the discussion. Before I introduce our panel, I'd like to encourage you again to submit questions for our speakers via the platform. Can I emphasize, please keep your questions short and concise, and use the @ symbol to direct your question to a specific presenter. As you probably know at this stage, you can also upvote questions that have already been submitted and that you want to hear asked to our speakers. We will get to as many of the questions submitted as possible during the Q&A discussion at the end of this session. I'd now like to welcome the first of our panelists. Odile Le Bolloch is a scientist at the Environmental Protection Agency with over 20 years experience working on sustainability and environmental issues. She leads the food waste prevention team and specializes in developing and delivering initiatives to promote food waste prevention and encourage behavior change in homes and businesses across Ireland, including the successful Stop Food Waste programme. Odile, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dermot, and thanks to Lorraine for a fascinating presentation on engaging with people and bringing about change in society. I wanted to provide a practitioner's perspective and I suppose talk about how we are applying some of the approaches and insights that have been discussed today to the work that we're doing on household food waste. And as you mentioned, Stop Food Waste is our national campaign for householders. And we started the programme back in 2009, and it was a time when nobody was talking about food waste. And I suppose we set about building up this awareness raising campaign, and we wanted it to be positive and helpful and informative. And we felt, you know, it was important that we were a trusted source of information. So anything that we put was based on facts and data. And I think, you know, one of the key things that we recognized at an early stage is no one wastes food on purpose. And we weren't about pointing fingers. It was to try and provide awareness and get people thinking and talking about the issue. And I think more importantly, we realized it's not about waste, actually, it's about food. So that was kind of the framing of our program. And that's, I suppose, how we developed it over the years. We worked quite originally on kind of instinct driven, our approach was, and you know, whenever we were asked for people who are target audiences, the general public, it was always, you know, the general public. So I think, you know, some of the things that have been spoken about today have been really interesting on just knowing how to break down your audience a little bit more. I think one of the other key things that we were always mindful was you need not to normalize wasting food. So you need to kind of temper the huge amounts of food being wasted style of message and focus a lot on the positive things that people are doing and people can do. I think definitely we recognise some of the issues discussed earlier today in terms of how do you go from awareness to behaviour change? How can we move from instinct-driven activities to more insight-driven approaches? And more importantly, how do we achieve a wider impact and measure the effectiveness of what we're actually doing? So last year, we reviewed our programme of activities, and we had a realignment of our approach so that we could kind of improve the design and the implementation process. And we, through the review process, we recognised we had a strong foundation. Stop Food Waste was actually well recognised and well regarded, which was very reassuring to hear. But the review did highlight the importance of awareness raising, that we needed to maintain a constant presence and we needed to amplify our messaging. And I suppose building on the review recommendations, we developed a strategy that had a greater focus on applying behavioural insights to inform our activities and using evidence-based communications, and also then obviously have a strong monitoring and evaluation element. So to support the revised approach, we pulled together data, evidence and behavioural insight studies that were either done or we did some of them ourselves. And I suppose we have a good history in the EPA of developing waste data. We produce waste statistics. So we were able to produce, food waste data, but we definitely needed to conduct more studies in terms of to improve the quality of the data and the granularity, yet again, to plug that information gap and have a lot more confidence in the facts and figures that we're giving to people, make sure that, our uncertainty over this data wasn't undermining the message that we want to get through. And then a key piece of work that we did was we conducted a national study on Irish attitudes towards food waste and food management behaviours in the home. And we worked closely with Behaviour and Attitudes, who are a leading company in the survey business. And we designed the survey, we provided input into the questions, the types of the information we identified as important, building on our expertise of years of experience working in this, and then also just in terms of international best practice, how that was evolving. And, the survey kind of had four main topics. One was looking at people's attitudes to food waste, who they thought should do something about it, how they buy their food, that kind of thing. Then there was more about behaviours in the home, people who were using, good food organisation behaviours, people who weren't. And we included some spotlight topics as well. We also looked at COVID behaviours, same idea, this disruptive experience that it kind of had more people at home using all the food they had, meal planning, you were going shopping, you didn't want, to be going shopping more than you had to, that kind of thing. And then we also had a longer term picture in mind. So the idea was, that we would provide some kind of segmentation that would help us understand more different groups in the population that we could target our message. So I think the really encouraging finding that we got from our research was actually those who think about food waste are more likely to follow good food organisation behaviours. And that supported our call for targeted awareness raising. It's likely if we can get people thinking about food waste, they're more likely to adopt the behaviours. Our more streamlined approach now is that our communications activities are based on an evidence-based plan. We have a baseline that we've established with our survey. We've our target audiences identified, and we're also obviously going to repeat these surveys to help us monitor the changes in engagement and evaluate the activities that we're doing. And I think, another really key piece is we will do things like waste characterizations that'll help us track on the ground work when it comes to our surveys as well. Sorry, just finally, just by way of an example, we had a campaign last year that we had decided was probably going to be about telling people about the dates, the difference between a use by date and a best before date, because our survey did show us that quite a significant amount of people throw away food because it reaches a date of some sort. But what we actually found was people understood the difference between the two dates, but they were still throwing it out. So instead, we decided to turn our campaign and provide a simple message that if you can't eat it by the use by date, freeze it, because we did find that quite a significant amount of people, more than half, didn't realize that you could freeze food right up to its use by date. So it's just an illustration of how we're now using these insights to help inform our communications campaign. Thank you.
Odile, thanks very much. It's really useful to get that practitioner perspective and kind of drill down into some of that work you've been doing. I think there'll be some interesting questions to come back to in terms of comparing the survey that you've done with some of the work we heard perhaps in the earlier panel. I'd now like to hand over to our next speaker, who is Anya Ogorman. Anya is the Activism Support Officer with Friends of the Earth and Mobilisation Coordinator with the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition. Anya coordinates a network of local climate action groups across Ireland, and her work aims to create a two-way link between climate policy and people and communities. Anya, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Dermot. So it's great to be here to have the opportunity to talk about the work that I've been doing with people across Ireland through Friends of the Earth and the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition over the last year and a half. And I suppose what we've really been working on is to support people to learn about, engage with and advocate for faster and fairer climate action in Ireland. And for us and for this One Future network of local groups around the country that I work very closely with, faster climate action means climate action that's urgent, science aligned and in line with our moral obligations to our fair share. And fairer climate action is climate action that's accessible to all people and makes life better for everyone who lives here. So we'll talk a little bit about why we did this work, how we're doing this work, and finally some practical observations and recommendations from this work. So why do we do this? So we've seen a huge increase in climate awareness over the last few years. I'm sure many of you here have seen that as well. We know that people care about climate. People want to be able to have informed conversations about climate. Lots of people understand that climate action can be done in a way that can negatively impact people already made vulnerable in our society, or it can be a positive, timely, fair, just transition for everyone. People are aware of that. And finally, the thing we've really noticed from the conversations we have with people is that people are doing their part. They are doing as much as is possible, practicable, accessible and affordable as individuals, families and communities, but they know that the big changes come with government legislation, support structures, infrastructure and policy decisions. And the hundreds of people we've engaged with over the last year and a half are quite tired of being told those old kind of tropes of, turn off your tap, save a bit of water, while they're looking at things like schools across the country forced to get planning permission to put up a few solar panels, fossil fuel infrastructure being facilitated and receiving billions in subsidies, low-income households struggling and locked out of retrofitting and clean renewable energy, and communities fighting for segregated cycle lanes and public transport. So given all this, what do we do? So we committed to bringing policy to people and people to policy. So we started by holding regular webinars open to everyone, just basically outlining our key understandings of key climate policy issues in the Irish landscape. And it was really amazing because as the time went on and as our webinars went on, registration numbers for these started out at around like 50, 70, our usual suspects that we would have maybe been engaging with over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And suddenly we saw those numbers start to skyrocket up to 600, 700 people registering for webinars. And at these events, people consistently asked us, how do I take action on this? Like, I'm learning about this. I'm really interested. How do I take action on this? So we started trying to facilitate that. So we started hosting these things called call-a-thons, where these were just Zoom calls where people got together during the day. They got to ask our policy experts questions, and then they called their politicians to talk about some of the issues that they cared about. This then escalated and culminated in a one-day event last December, where we had 1,200 people meeting over 100 TDs online in one day to talk about climate action. And what was particularly notable is that these large numbers came because those local groups around the country, those One Future groups, reached out organically to people in their local areas and built up the attendance themselves. So what's really clear is that people from across the country are ready to take action, rural and urban. They simply need the information and the supportive spaces to engage meaningfully. And finally, our most recent series of events focused on the government's Climate Action Plan consultation. And we really welcomed the fact that the government are committed to large-scale consultations with the public. However, we know, and what we've been talking about in the last few minutes, is that meaningful engagement requires time spent giving people adequate information so that they can make informed decisions. It also requires taking the time to really reach out to hear the voices of all members of society. So like members of the travelling community who spend on average 25% of their weekly income on fuel, when 10% is the indicator for fuel poverty, or disabled people who have very specific needs about new transport infrastructure design. People need the opportunity to hear the issues and the options to raise questions and debate the issues and raise concerns. And if we want as much of society as possible to be bought into and engaging with the urgent climate action we need, we just need to spend the time talking to them. So we held a 7-part workshop series. Diarmuid was there for one of the sessions, focusing on different sections in the consultation, giving people a chance to hear from experts, hear from leading thinkers, hear from social justice panels, and dig deeper into the topics. We gave people a chance to go into breakout rooms with smaller groups of people so they could really tease out some of the issues and have the difficult conversations. And the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. 87% of people said that they'd really like the government to run workshops like this. And it also resulted in a large number of people reporting that they did the consultation where otherwise they wouldn't have felt confident to do so. So I'll just leave you quickly with 3 observations and 3 recommendations. So firstly, the observations. People know that this is the big challenge and they are ready and they want to engage, but there's an information gap. And the second thing is that people across the country want large-scale action that makes it easier for everyone to live sustainably in Ireland. The third thing is that people across the country want to be involved in how this happens in their communities. And the 3 recommendations. First of all, we need to talk to everyone. We need significant increase in funding and commitment to engage everyone in every community in Ireland to co-create faster, fairer, shared transition to zero emissions. Secondly, we need to inform everyone. People want easily accessible, digestible information in order to have the difficult conversations we need to have with our families, our friends, our communities, and our politicians. It's really hard to make good informed decisions otherwise. And finally, we need to listen and learn from the people already doing this public engagement work and transition work across the country. Teresa O'Donoghue in Clare, Cultivation Tipperary, Sean McCabe from Task in Dublin City and rural Donegal, Susie Cannon Wicklow, Good Energies Alliance in Leitrim. There's loads of people with loads of experience out there doing this public engagement work, and we just need to sit and listen and hear from them. And finally, this is the work we need to do. This is really it. People are ready. They just need the time, the energy, and the resources. And I think we always just need to remember why we want to do this. And it's because we know that another world is possible and we want everyone coming along with us and thriving there. Thanks.
Anya, thanks very much for those insights, really interesting perspectives, and really interesting, I think, to hear how an organisation such as yours pivoted to going online, because, of course, a lot of that engagement and mobilization would traditionally have been in person. I thought it was really interesting to hear you talk also about kind of reaching wider audiences, and I think that connects to some important themes that we heard in the previous panel, and we might come back to some of those themes. Can I remind the audience that if you're on social media to please tag us using the hashtag Climate Conference 2021. And can I also remind you about the conference poll? The question is, who do you think should take most action on climate change? So please complete that poll through the online platform. Next, we will hear from Dr. Clare Watson. Clare is MaREI's Engagement Research Support Officer, based in the Environmental Research Institute in UCC. She joined MaREI in 2015 to carry out PhD research on the challenge of engaging communities in the energy transition, and is currently leading an engaged research team working with Dingle Peninsula 2030, helping to transition the peninsula to a sustainable future. Clare, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diarmuid. And thanks, Lorraine, for your very interesting presentation. What you say ticks so many boxes, and I particularly like your point about the need to build a sense of collective action, because this is where Carcagreena and Dingle Peninsula 2030 comes in. In early 2018, 4 intrepid agencies, the Dingle Creativity and Innovation Hub, ESB Networks, Northeast West Kerry Development, and ourselves in MaREI came together on the Dingle Peninsula to support the local community in creating a low-carbon, sustainable future for the area. Over the 3 years, we've developed a number of projects, including a community energy mentor course, an anaerobic digestion feasibility study, an on-farm program collecting real-time data, a series of home energy trials, an EV trial, community planning workshops, and a sustainable transport pilot. Out of these initiatives have emerged the Kirkagreena Community Energy Group, a West Kerry dairy farmers sustainable energy community with 90 local members, and a number of other fledgling groups. Led by the MaREI Engaged research team, we are also reflecting on what we're doing, on what works and doesn't work, and we're producing co-created learning briefs and journal papers, which you can find on our website. While we know it's not enough to meet the challenge, we hope we're building important foundation stones for ramped up action into the future. So what have we learned so far? We're learning that it's very important to involve people at all levels, from the local community to local agencies and to national bodies. But we need to start from where different people are at, and to do this, it's important to develop working relationships and collaborations. Successful collaborations foster trust, creativity, and understanding. The combined experiences and expertise stimulate better solution making and problem solving. But collaborations don't happen on their own. They need to be set up, nurtured, and supported. Co-production requires time, patience, and an understanding of where partners are coming from and the context in which they operate. It is clear that the low-carbon transition requires strong local communities. There are fears on the Dingle Peninsula that climate policy measures are just another intervention that will disproportionately impact rural communities. Unless fundamental needs such as employment, housing, and social services are met, the community will lack the societal capacity to engage. The co-benefits of aligning climate action with community development goals are clear, such as comfortable homes, eliminating fuel poverty, improving cohesion and well-being, stimulating job creation, and improving connectivity. However, actually realizing them requires careful consideration and planning. It is accepted that fostering deep and ongoing community engagement and participation in climate action is crucial. However, the resources and the organizational structures are not yet in place for this to happen. Effective community engagement is a skill in itself, which requires appropriate knowledge, experience, and expertise, and the ability to be flexible and innovative. While volunteers are key, we can no longer expect them to do all the work or to scale up their activities to the level that is required, unless they are adequately supported and resourced. Political leadership and support is essential at all levels, and thankfully this is now beginning to materialise. However, current government policies do not seem to appreciate the importance of having skilled, full-time community-based resources dedicated to engaging and involving the local community. While acknowledging the fear of creating staff positions that become full-time with associated rights and ongoing commitments, the reluctance by the Exchequer to fund people, as opposed to funding once-off capital costs, needs to change. Delivering the low-carbon transition will require new organisational structures, both within local authorities and within communities. The current local government structures do not adequately provide for the sub-county and community levels. While it is great to see decarbonisation zones being chosen by local authorities and to know that Dingle Peninsula has been proposed by Kerry County Council, the next step is to ensure they work effectively with and for the local community. The government recently announced a new initiative on connected hubs, of which there are 400 around the country, giving them the opportunity to identify and develop their own solutions in consultation with local authorities, businesses, and community groups. The Dingle Hub has played a key role in our initiative. It has two pillars of work, one relating to sustainability and the other to digitalisation. We suggest that this model has the potential for widespread adoption across the country, as it would allow the various Exchequer-funded investments to operate in a cost-effective manner. And finally, if we want to bring communities with us, we need to be humble. And I know this is a hard one for some of us, including myself. We need to avoid preaching, shaming, and telling people what to do. It is better to work with empathy so that we are open to seeing the challenge from other people's perspectives. We need to start from where people are at, not from where we want them to be. Thank you.
Claire, thank you so much for that. The Dingle 2030 project is a really interesting and inspiring initiative. I've now had the pleasure of hearing several presentations over many months about it, and it's always interesting to hear about the project and its progress. And I think some of your remarks very much echo previous comments in this panel and in other panels, including your last remark there about basically meeting people where they are. I think those words or words like them have been spoken by several contributors over the course of the last 2 days. It was also interesting to hear you talk about the constraints, the organisation and structural constraints around community engagement, and I hope we'll be able to come back to that in the discussion. I'd now like to invite all of our speakers to join me on screen to respond to some questions. So I would encourage you all to continue submitting your questions through the platform and to vote on questions that you see in the platform that have been submitted by others. There is, in terms of the popularity stakes, there is a clear winner that I can see at the moment as an opening question, and it's a question to Professor Whitmarsh. But I think there might be an opportunity for some of our other panelists to come in on it, or a version of that question subsequently. So the question is from Katie Harrington, who says, given the time and resources needed to roll out deliberative forums such as citizens' assemblies and juries, do you see a middle ground for rolling out community-level participatory mechanisms in order to understand what's important to them and interventions that they can rally behind and tailor communications to reflect this?
Yeah, this is a really good question, I think. I think it's about kind of reflecting on the practical resources required to deliver some of these participatory interventions. Even though they're incredibly valuable, they take time, they take money as well. So I think that's a really important point that's being flagged. And I think that this suggestion that actually we can do a lot at community level is really critical, as we've heard from the other speakers. Actually, it's often easier to get people involved at a local level because they can kind of see the relevance of these issues for their lives, and also there's usually a stronger sense of efficacy that actually they can make a difference at that local and community level. So I think that more kind of local level at which to involve people is really critical. And so I think that is important, but I think at the same time we also need to be kind of having better ways of communicating and engaging with people at a broader level, and actually sort of, I guess, developing a shared vision of where we're all going to, as well as better information about kind of the options available for reaching that target. So I think we need that local participatory approach. We also need kind of broader information and engagement as well.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. I might link that to a broader question that has been posed to the panel as a whole, which is from Brian Byrne, who says, in Ireland today, there are many instances where volunteer groups, e.g. Tidy Towns environmental networks, are actually outperforming local government and local authorities in addressing environmental issues and practices in their localities. What are your thoughts on what is needed to better align these different official and social efforts? And I think between our three other panelists, we have three speakers, I guess, spanning the state and non-state, or state and non-state initiatives. So I might pose that question to each of you. Odile, could I maybe start with you on that? Do you think about how your initiatives interact or can complement civil society or non-state initiatives in food waste?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And in fact, you know, when we started with Stop Food Waste, we had a thing called the Stop Food Waste Challenge, which was a community-based initiative where we worked with groups in the community. The idea being a bit more intensive interaction with them over a period of a few weeks. And they learnt a bit more about their habits in relation to food waste and reducing food waste, that kind of thing. And, you know, we found that people engaged, but we were talking to a lot of people who were already converted to the message. And I think, you know, resources being what they were as well, we're a small program, you know, when you're trying to compete with advertising expenditure, things like that, yeah, really do have to focus on what you're trying to do. And this is where our review came from last year, where we were trying to think, how do we reach the people, the everyday people, you know, not the community groups, but everyone who's too busy, who doesn't have time to, you know, meal plan, all of that kind of thing. So this is where our segmentation helped us a little bit. And, you know, we've started even just with a younger male cohort who are on the go. They're just busy. They buy food when they need it. You know, they actually say they waste a lot of food and they want to do something about it. So I think even that has given us more insights into how you reach these people. And it definitely, as part of our strategy, develops how we reach out those target audiences. Sometimes it'll be online, other times it might be in person. But I think our role definitely is to make sure that we provide safe, good information for people. So if community groups do want to look at reducing their food waste, they pick an effective action, you know, instead of thinking maybe what needs to be done. There's information out there and they can come to us as a trusted source of information.
Thanks, Odile. Anya, could I come to you on that question as someone operating in the civil society space?
Absolutely. So I suppose there's a couple of things. First of all, like, I fundamentally believe that people in their own communities have the solutions. They know what's best for their communities. As long as they have access to, you know, experts, people who are thinking about this, and the opportunity to have those discussions, then people can have the solutions that are best for their communities within that broader context, obviously, of top-down climate policy. And I think a lot of it does come down to funding, as Clare, or as Clare was speaking about earlier, but funding people within the communities to do these roles. Like, we know that with the climate consultation this year, the PPNs were used as local based spaces for community groups to engage with the consultation, to talk about what they wanted in their communities. And that's great, but we need more funding for that work. We need somebody dedicated in those spaces to be reaching out to the communities, to listen to what's going on, to bring it back to government level, so as there is more synergy. And it's really about trusting, I think, and it's about going, oh, you know, we're not going to come in and not listen to you and suddenly come up with this great idea when you're a community group and you've been working on this for ages. So it's about listening, trusting, funding, I think, and giving information.
Yeah, thanks very much. Clare, can I bring you in? I mean, I think you've already expressed some of that frustration that the questioner was articulating in your original comments, but do you have any further
I mean,
thoughts?
It is about coordination, but we're very lucky in Dingle in that we recently got funding, so we've just employed a community engagement coordinator, and that's so that we can reach out, because it is the thing that if you organise an event, the usual suspects will turn up, or the same people are already converted. So we're really hoping that Tom will actually be able to draw in people, and he'll go to where people are, you know, and organise events with them, and that the whole thing of participation, you know, that they're involved in organising rather than it being us organising for other people. But I think it's really important that we also include people who feel marginalised, you know, or who may not necessarily even be hearing the messages. So when you're in a local community, it is easier to do that because you've a fixed catchment area. And if you're working with people who know people in the area, then it is relatively easy.
Thanks very much, Clare. Lorraine, could I come back to you with a different question that's been posed by Jean Moore, who asks, what have been the most effective ways of feeding in your insights to upstream interventions, and what can Ireland learn from your insights and your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I suppose one thing is, again, sort of thinking about what we heard in a previous session, actually, that in order to get this structural change, these upstream measures, we do need public buy-in. And so actually it is really important to engage with people in order to get that support, and in order to kind of win over the political will to feel empowered to make those changes. So I think there's something there about kind of that awareness that we need sort of public engagement to be able to deliver the upstream measures. And then in terms of, I guess, which measures are most effective, there's a growing evidence base about, you know, what sort of things can we do, and over what timescales are they most effective? Because it certainly takes quite a long time maybe to shift people's values, but arguably we do need to start to do that, you know, to reconfigure what we understand by quality of life, and, you know, where does our well-being come from, etc. So that could be a longer term project. But there are definitely some things that we can do in the shorter term. And one example is comes from kind of nudge theory, which is sort of using defaults. So actually, if you just kind of by default put people on a green energy tariff, a renewable energy tariff, actually the evidence suggests that about 90% of people will stick with that tariff, even if it costs them a little bit more than the fossil fuel alternative. It's just this kind of bias to just stick with the status quo and not change what the default setting is, even though they've got the choice to switch out. So whereas if you make people opt in to get renewable energy, it's usually kind of a few percent, 5% or something will choose it. So it makes a really big difference what the default option is. And that's a super quick win that you could just implement, I think, fairly quickly. So there's lots of other examples about, you know, how you can change behavior relatively quickly. And another one is kind of climate disclosure. And yeah, so there's I think lots of studies now showing how effective these different strategies can be.
Great, Lorraine, thanks very much. Can I ask a question to try and tie this discussion to the previous discussion in the previous panel around that Tony's presentation segmenting the audience in the 6 Americas, and we know that work is ongoing to segment the Irish population in the same way. Can I ask each of you for reflections on that, and particularly Tony's reflections or the message of needing to get beyond the alarmed, that already engaged group. So I hope that's a question that all of the panelists can respond to. Lorraine, could I ask you to comment first of all?
Yeah, I mean, so as I kind of touched on in my presentation, really, you know, for people who are very skeptical about climate change, and as Tony said, there probably aren't that many people in Ireland relative to the US who are really skeptical and denialist about climate change, but there may be a group trying to convince them about climate change just probably doesn't work. So I wouldn't sort of waste your time. But that said, a lot of people probably have other things that they're more worried about than climate change. And so, you know, that might be saving money or their health or, you know, their children's well-being or, yeah, a myriad of other kind of worries. And the more that we can, I think, understand those worries and then tailor our messages to those concerns and to the kind of co-benefits of mitigation that will also kind of help them with their day-to-day needs and address their values, then the more we're likely to be able to communicate with that broader public, that not just the alarmed group, but the people that most of the public actually who are, you know, a bit worried about climate change, but have other things to worry about as well. So yeah, it's about kind of really targeting those co-benefits and the things that people are worried about.
Great, thanks, Lorraine. I might go around the rest of the panel. If you could maybe reflect on that, Odile. I know you've done some of that work yourself. Can I maybe throw into the mix as well? Is there a socioeconomic? Do you do any socioeconomic segmentation in your survey?
Actually, no, that was what was really interesting, was because traditionally you do tend to look at socioeconomic breakdown of the general population, but we actually, they were segmented according to their attitudes and behaviours around food and food waste. So we did find, you know, there's a key cohort in the middle, a bit like with the climate change, you know, that they're too busy. They want to do something, but they're just too busy to do it. Some of them are just generally, you know, they're poor planners and they deprioritize food and food management behaviours. Others, as I said, like that slightly younger cohort, they kind of, we identified an education gap there in terms of how you reduce food waste and, you know, cooking skills, food management behavior. And they're generally, as I said, they're just too busy. There is the very end segment, people who just aren't interested, you know, about 10% of the population who are, you know, you'd be lucky if you get them to put their food waste in the right bin, basically. And then you have the champions on the other end who you can harness. In fact, you know, you've got the social advocates who plan, they, you know, they get their meal planning right. They, you know, they believe food waste, you know, they see it's linked to environmental improvements and climate change, and they're real advocates for the cause. So obviously that's a group that you could try and target to harness the message. But really the middle group, there's a door to push there open in terms of they, you know, they think a bit about food waste. When they do think about it, they think they should be doing more. So I think, you know, for now, this middle group is where we're focusing our effort, because it can be a bit too much trying to target people that, you know, aren't really going to engage anyway.
Thanks, Odile. Anya, can I bring you in on this and maybe throw a little bit more your way, and keeping an eye on the questions. And there was a question about the rural-urban divide in the context of climate change. So the same question to you about, you know, the segmentation of the Irish population, but throwing into the mix the urban-rural divide, and the fact that presumably the people who typically show up to your workshops or your webinars are most likely in that alarmed category. You talked in your intervention about the need to go beyond and to speak to everyone. Can you tell us a bit about how you try to do that?
Sure, you're giving me the Leaning Tower of Pisa here with different issues. Yeah, so I think what we're seeing is there is actually a big amount of people, like traditionally people are like, oh, you know, it's the people in the city who care about the climate because they're able to use public transport and they're able to cycle their bikes, and, you know, there's no farmers there. And we're seeing across the country people turning up and engaging with us. Now, yes, we're seeing people who are, you know, I've been working on this. The reason I moved to the countryside is I live in Cloughjordan, and I've been working on this for years and years. But we're also seeing, you know, young dairy farmers coming to our events. We're seeing, you know, concerned grandparents who have been like living in rural Ireland for all their lives. And I think there is a massive, massive, massive shift in how many people are thinking around what they're thinking about climate. You know, even I was having a really interesting conversation on a personal note. I come from very, very rural Ireland with some friends, and they were saying that, you know, we were having a discussion about agriculture, and we ended up in a big discussion about public transport and how public transport needs to be significantly increased in rural Ireland. So I suppose when we don't segment our messages as such, our messages are quite broad, but what we try to do is create the space for those conversations to be had. So we create the space for people from rural Ireland to talk to people from Dundee, or people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to say, do you know what, I can't afford to retrofit my house. So, you know, this current government policy doesn't work for me. So I think just when I was thinking about your original question around segmenting our messaging and thinking about what we're saying, a lot of it is thinking about who are we talking to, and as Lorraine was saying, what are their needs, what are the issues, and how do we talk to them in a way that doesn't make them switch off, that doesn't make them go, sure, I can't access that. You know, there's no point in trying to encourage the small village that I come from in rural Ireland, to encourage me to stop using my car and taking a bus. There is no bus. You know, there's no point in, you know, berating people because they're not retrofitting their homes when they can't access the grants. And I think that's the big piece of communications that we have to deal with, is that making the options accessible to people. And that's how we can communicate well with people, I think.
Yeah, thanks very much, Claire. I won't add any further layers to an already overloaded question, but can I ask you to come in?
Just something I wanted to throw into the mix is that maybe we don't need to talk about climate change at all. You know, it is certainly much easier to talk to people about energy. You know, there's so many different facets and different interesting bits to energy. The other thing is, I think we need to be mindful of the impact of peer-to-peer pressure and social norms, which I know Lorraine mentioned. But it's really important, if you watch locally, people are watching people like themselves. They're watching people from their own kind of grouping or their own area. I mean, in Ireland, we're quite local. Even in local areas, we're even more local in townships. So it's important to bring that into the mix and to try and encourage local leaders to get involved, you know, because people are watching each other and they respect people locally. So for instance, we have a really interesting dairy farmers group, and it's been set up by a local dairy farmer. You know, so he's been able to get 90 dairy farmers onto the list, you know, and they're beginning to look at their energy use. You know, so that's the focus that is easiest for them to look at initially, and that's brilliant.
Claire, thank you very much for that. We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to go around each of our panelists for concluding comments, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to offer any concluding remarks, but also perhaps to reflect on the question that, or the theme that Lorraine identified towards the end of her presentation, about COVID and this moment for change and the disruption of COVID. So that's something for each of the panelists to reflect upon in closing remarks, just to give you some advance warning. We only have about 1 minute each for each of the of our panelists. So Lorraine, I might hand the floor to you first of all and ask you to offer some closing remarks.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I think now we have a historic opportunity to really reconfigure our society. And I mean, we needed to do it anyway for climate change, but now that our lives have been so disrupted, we have seen how we can do things differently and how people can come together in collective ways and support one another. And I think this can hearten us to show what sort of transformation can happen and how people can be, you know, at the heart of that. So I think there's a lot we can learn from COVID, and I think we can actually use this to our advantage in many ways to actually achieve what we need to for climate change. So yeah, I think lots of lessons and lots of opportunities.
Thanks, Lorraine. Odile, over to you.
Yeah, I suppose I think it's really important that we don't overwhelm people. I think we need to provide solutions that people can do. Any messaging and campaigns need to be about one simple thing that you can do rather than the whole gamut of do all of this at the same time. And I agree, yeah, COVID, there's very great lessons there. We can actually show people, look, you can do this. You have been doing it for the last 15 months. Just keep up some of that behaviour and that will have an impact.
Thanks, Odile. Anya, over to you.
Yeah, so I think that COVID has obviously suddenly opened up the entire, am I muted? No, opened up the entire country to this information. You know, we've seen this complete rise from, 50 people in Dublin attending our events to 600 people, 700 people from across the country coming and engaging and being involved and wanting to share and learn. And I think one of the key things that I forgot to mention in my last input, that is thinking about climate action as community development, and Task are really doing a really interesting project around that. But people are attending these events because they're online, they're accessible, but we need to think even a little bit deeper. There's people out there who can't access the internet. So we think about community development, giving proper rural broadband into communities so as people can engage on climate in their communities. We need to be thinking in this broad way, and I think COVID has given us that opportunity to think about how do we revitalise communities in a green, fast, fair way that will reduce emissions.
Anya, thanks very much. And last but not least, Claire.
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID has given some of us the chance to stop and breathe and to think, and we've become more knowledgeable about our local environment. And I think the challenge now is that we don't segue back into business as usual, that we can make it into the new era. But something obviously, I mean, one of the speakers said yesterday that we have the science, and I would say we have pretty much all the technology. What we don't have are the resources going into people. And I think that's really where the focus is now.
Great, Claire, thanks so much. And thank you to all of our panelists, to our keynote speaker, Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, to Odile, to Anya, and to Claire. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I wish we had time for more, but unfortunately the clock is against us. There's been loads of food for thought, plenty of ideas to take forward, and I think interesting reflections there at the end about the opportunity COVID provides us to move forward and to move forward with more ambitious climate action. So last but not least, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your participation and the questions and your active engagement. And I'd now like to hand back to Mary Frances Rochford, who will give the closing conference summary. Sure. Okay, we seem to be having a little bit of technical trouble with Mary Frances Rochford. Mary Frances, are you unmuted now?
I'm here now, thanks.
Excellent, we'll hand back over to you again.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Dermot. Just to start by having a quick look at the summary of our poll, which was run on the platform for the duration of the afternoon. The question was, who do you think should take most action on climate change? Was it you, government, industry, business, or a combination of above? And overwhelmingly, it was almost 67% on a combination of all of the above. And interestingly, the same question was part of a Twitter poll for the afternoon, and it came in with 61% to say a combination of the above. I would like to thank all our participants from this afternoon and the two sessions, who I think were very successful in highlighting the importance of understanding the attitudes, behaviours, the psychological and cultural preferences of different audiences in how we address climate change, and how this is really going to be a very important part of informing Ireland's climate transition, alongside political frameworks, technological advances and emissions reductions, really building on our discussion from yesterday. I would like to thank our keynote speakers across the 2 days, our panelists and our chairpersons, for sharing your insights and expertise. I'd like to thank our own team here in the EPA responsible for the planning and running of this event, and the team in Go West and their partners who've been working so hard behind the scenes to keep us all on track. And to you, of course, for attending and participating with some really insightful and engaging questions over the 2 days. We'd ask that you please complete the feedback survey via the app and let us know what you thought to help inform future events. All the recordings of all the presentations will be available on the EPA YouTube channel. And we'd ask, as you leave us from this virtual environment today, that if you're talking about our conference online, that you use the hashtag ClimateConference2021. Just one final thing on behalf of my colleagues here in the EPA, to let you know that the EPA research call is currently open up until mid-July. So if we have any academic participants on the call today, just to alert you to that fact. Once again, I'd like to thank you for attending and to bring today's event to a close.